One of the biggest challenges when we're studying moral philosophy is that there's not just one way of looking at morality. In fact, there are a lot of different schools of thoughts, and they're called ethical systems. Let's start with one called cultural relativism. What moral relativism says is that morality changes. It's different from culture to culture. So in other words, culture A can't judge culture B by culture A's moral standards. So for example, here in the United States, we have certain moral codes. So a cultural relativist would say, we here in the United States can't judge people in Germany by our moral code because we're Americans and they're Germans and we do things a different way. On the surface, that seems to make sense. When you dig a little bit deeper, maybe it doesn't, and that's for a couple different reasons. Not the least of which is we're not members of just one culture. Just think about the United States here. Think about each of us. As we are here in the US, yes, we're part of United States culture, but we're also part of Western culture in general. In addition, we're part of cultures within our families. We are part of cultures within our religions, those of us who belong to organized religions. We're part of cultures within our neighborhoods. On occasion, morals among those different cultures can conflict. So the cultural relativist is left maybe confused, as certain morals in certain cultures that they belong to are in conflict. It throws the logic of cultural relativism a little bit out of whack. Another big challenge with cultural relativism is when atrocities are happening, but explained away by simply being part of a culture. Take, for example, the practice of female genital mutilation. You can read more about that in the link that I provided. When that's explained away as being part of a culture, sometimes that's just not good enough. Maybe there are some things that are simply right and simply wrong. When we really take a close look, cultural relativism might not be as good as it appears to be on the surface. So speaking of relativism, let's move on to subjective relativism. Subjective relativism is a pretty simple school of thought when it comes to morality, ethics. Subjective relativism essentially says, if I think it's right, it's right. Everything is subjective. If I believe that my action is morally acceptable, then it is. If I believe that, well, in a classroom, it is morally acceptable for me to stab a student in the eye with a dry erase marker, then it is morally acceptable for me to stab a student in the eye with a dry erase marker. And the student who's being stabbed in the eye with a dry erase marker might not think that's morally okay, and they're right, but so am I, because everybody is always right. The challenge with subjective relativism is, if everybody's always right, what common ground do we have to actually debate ethics? What common ground do we actually have to determine what is morally acceptable and what is not morally acceptable? If we're all always right, can anyone ever be wrong? Can anything ever be considered simply not acceptable? Let's talk about utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a theory that weighs the outcome versus the actions that it takes to get there. Utilitarianism wants an outcome that produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Not a bad plan. The challenge with utilitarianism is that utilitarianism is kind of an ends justifies the means sort of approach. So as long as the outcome produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people, it doesn't really matter what we do to get there. So let's take an example of, how about a village? A village with very little healthcare, very little medical care. And there is a baby or a small child who is extremely ill. And that small child, that ill child, is going to take most of the resources, most of the medical resources that the village has. Killing that child would actually result in the greatest good for the greatest number of people, because the supply of medicines and food would be there for the rest of the village. So the utilitarian would say, kill the child, because that would result in the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Finally, and these are not the only 4 schools of thought, but they're the 4 that we're going to talk about, there's universal morality. Universal morality says some things are right and some things are wrong, period. Regardless of culture, regardless of location, regardless of person, regardless of anything else, there are some things that are simply good and there are some things that are simply bad. There are some things that are just right and there are some things that are just wrong. Think about that for a minute. Read the story about genital mutilation and think about that for a minute.